Hello and welcome to the Digital Transformist. I'm Mike Lavista, and I'm thrilled to say we have Jason Niedle, CEO of Teos, with us today. Jason, good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, as often happens in the podcast world, you go on a podcast, you go, actually, that guy's pretty interesting. I would love to talk to him about it. And so, I was on Jason's podcast a little while ago, and enough connections and overlap seemed to happen that we thought we'd try this again, go in the other directions. And I know for me at least, sometimes you don't get a chance to answer questions; you're too busy interviewing, so you get to kind of talk a little bit about what you're up to. So let's start with give people a little overview of what's your what's your origin story of how you got to this point, both with podcasting and with Tethos.
Yeah, so I'm Jason Niedle from Teos, as you said, and I do find it kind of funny to take one of your points really quickly in that I prefer to be behind the camera or behind the microphone on
Hmm.
the asking side of things and just to listen. And I said camera because I'm also a photographer and I find myself not wanting to be the one getting the photo taken of, but I want to be the one behind the camera.
Sure.
And it does definitely feel more comfortable for me to be on your side of the equation today, your side of the equation. Um, but I started out as a philosophy major and I thought, I'm going to be a lawyer and everything's going to be great. And I got a job just working on the side at a print shop. And back in the days, this was 30 plus years ago, a print shop meant, chemicals. And I was washing these plates and my hands would get blue from the dye. And
Hmm.
I'm like, oh, this is going to kill me one day if I keep doing this. Um, and I would literally go in the dark room and take pictures with this camera the size of my desk right now of the materials. And one day somebody said, "Hey, can you fix this type on a computer?" And it was like a 286 and
Hmm.
super slow, but I didn't know any better. And and I did that, and that was kind of cool. And then time went by, and it was a 386, and it was a 486, and pretty soon I was somehow doing basic art there, and I was still in college at the time. And I thought, I could go be a lawyer, and that's probably a guaranteed career, and the philosophy thing is great, or I
Yeah.
can just pursue this artistic realm and be creative, and who knows what's going to happen. And so I chose the creative path, and I really enjoy it. I love it. I might have made more money as an attorney, but I think I'm happier this way.
That's really great. And I want to thank you for something just now, which is in telling that story. One of my fondest memories, my mom was a bit of a photographer, and I remember being in the dark room and dipping and moving from one thing to another. And is there a fixer? I'm kind of blanking on
Yep.
some of the ideas there. And something about that smell is horrible and also nostalgic to me. Whenever I smell it, like I'm transported back to that moment doing photos with my mom. That's really fun. And so did you go all the way through the philosophy major at college? Like you finished and you were ready to go do pre-law and all that kind of stuff?
I did. I was like, okay, I go to law school, or I almost phrased at the time as like, you know, rich and I don't know if miserable is the right word, but rich and stuck in a certain path,
Mm.
or happy and poor.
Yeah.
That's really a false dichotomy, right? It isn't that at all. But
Mhm.
that's what it felt like at that moment. And I chose the creative side. Yeah.
So then if you're starting from, I don't want to say you're starting from scratch as a creative, but you kind of get this little, you get the bug a little bit. What were your iterations, kind of through and up to then starting a company to do that?
Yeah, so I didn't have much formal training, but I did have a pressman. And so Sam, the pressman, was a little bit off and he carried like a revolver in his sock every day to work. And he was a very angry man. And when I would make a mistake on my design side of things that didn't print well, he would come back and scream at me. And I was terrified. I was probably 19 or 20 years old. So I learned very, very rapidly to not make mistakes and to get everything as right as it could be.
Wow.
Um, and I laugh about it now, but I think it was actually kind of terrifying. But I did learn, and I had an amazing mentor. And along the way, there have been times where I don't have mentors, and I realized that was really something that supercharged me when I could sit next to someone and say,
Mhm.
you know, hey, how do you do this? I have no idea. And they would show me in 2 seconds, and I couldn't have figured that out. Um, and it brings me to another thought is of my wife is a voice teacher. And she said that her students today are so much better than anybody was in her era.
Hmm.
And I said, well, why is that? Why are they so much better? And she said, YouTube. She said, back then we would wait all
Absolutely.
week to maybe get a 1 hour lesson with someone. And now they can discover that information themselves and go practice the same video 50 or 100 times before they show up at me. And so to tie that little thread together, like I didn't always have a mentor, but I also back then didn't have a way to look that information up
Mm.
easily. And now we can actually look up anything we want or ask AI or whatever and get our answers. So it's really transformative in how fast we can learn.
I love that story because I know. So I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I've been a dedicated guitar player since I was a little kid. That was like my first career, and so I love your wife is in voice teaching, and I have the same feeling about kids learning guitar in my field from YouTube. It's like the expertise that kids can learn by age 10. I'm like, oh my god, it took me so long to figure any of this stuff out because you're doing it like little inch by inch, and and figuring a lot out by yourself. It's really amazing, and I think it almost kind of to cross over into the technical field we're in. I really think you can learn as much as you need to learn for development and programming on YouTube as you could in a school. What's missing, your other piece, which I love, is what is missing is a mentor or a teacher can guide you, help you avoid potholes, figure out the
Hmm.
thing you're stuck on. But I do think that the speed with which people are able to learn things now, just because of the availability, is really incredible and kind of exciting. And I wish, whatever, I wish I was 10 years younger to have experienced more of that.
Well, and what's interesting too is I'm struggling with this idea of what does it mean to be human when AI replaces the things that you spent your whole life learning how
Mm.
to do, and what does it make that what is it about what I do that can be better than the baseline
Yeah.
of these great AI tools that are coming out, and then how do I take and put that on top? Um, and I think that's just something that we're all going to struggle with, and that I'm struggling with, and getting clear. Clearly, it's emotion and relationships,
Yeah.
but on top of that, there's a higher level of problem solving that maybe in 10 years with quantum powered AI, it'll be better at. But will we still always be better than that? And we still always have to really focus on always learning. And
Yeah.
that's what I love about podcasting, by the way.
Well, so okay, so here's maybe we'll dive into a little bit of what you think about philosophically about this, because you are actually a graduated philosopher. So I often think about sometimes a lot of the value of learning is the struggle itself. So
Mm.
making it difficult to not difficult, but having to do the journey yourself, putting your own feet one foot in front of the other, seems to provide a different kind of learning. I was thinking recently, there's a book. You ever heard of Moonwalking with Einstein? Have you heard of that book?
I've heard of
Um,
it. I haven't read it.
it's a memory book, and it's a guy who goes into sort of the art and science of how to memorize incredibly long things. And one of the first things he does is learn how to memorize like 10 decks of cards in a row or something like that.
Mm.
And this was a skill that everyone who was educated had for a really long time. So the idea, like you hear about these Homeric epics, well, it's because people could remember 2 days worth of story because they had these systems. And so we're different now because we've decided. I think Einstein's the guy who said, "I don't need to know the answer. I just need to know to be able to where to look it up." And so
Mm.
we've gone all the way down the other end of the spectrum to say like, well, now we don't really, we might not need to think even about that lower level stuff. And I'm curious if either AI versus human, if you thought about that dichotomy and like what's good for us really?
I've thought about it, and it makes me wonder a little bit that do we end up at some point with it being such a crutch that the second that the power goes off for a minute that we don't know how to do our dishes, or even, like 10 years down the road, or my son, he's 10 right now,
Yeah.
right? When he's 25, does he not know how to drive a car because there were self-driving cars? And then one day the AI has a little glitch from a solar flare and no one can get anywhere because they don't know how to
Yeah.
drive?
Yeah.
I think
Well,
that's a real
honestly,
problem.
I mean, I think like, for example, if you were getting a time machine, go back 100 years, like, I don't know how to, uh, capture and, do something with a deer in the wild. Right. And there are some people that do it, but I don't. And we just keep kind of progressing past that. Like if the power went off for a month, I'd be in trouble because
Oh, we'd
all
all
my
be in
stuff
trouble.
relies on the power.
Yeah, we'd all be in trouble. There's a really interesting book, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of it, but it's essentially a primer. Like if you were time traveling, you take this book back and then you can do everything. And so you open the book, and the first thing in there, like what would you guess the first thing in the book that you need to know how to do, 1,000 years ago is?
Probably fire.
Fire was one of the first things. Yeah, that might have been one of the
Oh,
first things.
maybe water, where how to get water,
Soap.
shelters.
Soap was one of the
Soap,
very first things in there, right? How do you avoid
really?
disease? How do you avoid getting sick? You
Oh,
got to know
sure.
how to make soap,
Oh my
right?
God.
And so all these things that we just take for granted and that are all a part of long past history, right? It's it's
Yeah.
it's so interesting and so intriguing. So where are we, and how do we predict what we need to be doing 10 years from now?
Mhm.
I mean, the only thing we can predict is we have to keep growing with it all.
Yeah. And so if that's the apocryphal version of it, I think the promise is, well, what amazing things could we do were we to build on that long enough, you know? And so,
Yeah.
for example, you know, many of us don't know how to trap and do something with a deer, but we have advanced medicine, and even the development of AI itself is sort of a meta topic. Like we were advancing in a direction, and there's a point where we will be so far out that you're right. Losing power would be devastating to the culture, but I don't know. It's a direction we're certainly careening down, I guess. And it's fun because if I were to say, what's the reason I got into technology, is because I'm lazy. I love the idea of automating things I don't want to do. And
Yeah.
so that's a choice. You know, like people will pay more to buy something at a Walgreens because it's convenient than the little bit of extra time it would take to stop and go to a grocery store. Convenience always sells. I feel if there's a message that always points in one direction, that's one of the things that means that's why technology has grown so much. I don't know. What do you think about that idea?
100%. One of the things I was thinking about is this whole digital transformation of the world right now can lead in a way, one of two ways. And so if you look back at the Industrial Revolution,
Mm.
a whole bunch of people, probably the majority of the people, or a large percentage of people, ended up out of work and didn't have jobs. But
Mm.
then there was a whole another side of the people who ended up starting factories and becoming amazing
Yeah.
technicians and making things. And of course, that's where we all went. We know that because we're there now.
Mm.
But the same thing is happening in our world right now, right? So we can say, oh, I'm going to lay by the side of the road, or we can look to the future and say, what does the future look like, and how can I dream, and what is the dream of what can be done? And yeah, I do dream of a robot doing my dishes and handling the
Mm.
house stuff so that I can write stories and create things more beautiful than ever because I have tools
Yeah.
that superpower some of the things that were hard before.
Exactly. So if there's a fork in the road, I want to end up in the Star Trek universe and not the Wall-E universe.
Yes, right?
You know, because it is kind of a choice. But if we could just do nothing but exploration and music and art and all that kind of stuff, I mean, that's sign me up. I mean, that's what I'm interested in doing.
I've been teasing my wife, speaking of, well, speaking of nothing, speaking of what's going to happen in the future,
Yeah.
of like my career in some ways is being eaten by AI, except I'll grow above that and I'll keep solving the problems of growth,
Yeah.
right? Those will always be there, but I have to grow up and above it. Her career is getting more and more important because people don't come to her to hear music. If they want to hear music, they'll put on their,
Hmm.
put on their what do you call it, on their Spotify, and they'll listen to music.
Yeah.
They're coming to her because they want to feel their voice, to have their voice, to be powerful through their voice, and to
Hmm.
feel good about themselves, and to have that creative outlet. And it's like you playing guitar. You don't play the guitar to hear the music. You play the guitar for that level of self-fulfillment that only
Yeah.
becomes more important as technology advances.
Yeah. And I think I heard I was at a Warren Buffett thing a while ago, and a little kid asked, what's the thing that you think about to protect yourself against a downturn or something like that. And he kind of turned it in a weird angle, but what we ended up saying was, if you're the best at what you do, there will never be a downturn for you. And so if you're like as an expert vocal coach, you can learn a lot on YouTube, but no one's there watching me do my breathing and my diaphragm and how I'm holding my jaw. And this is like the little bit I know about singing I'm giving you.
Well, and
And
it's even
right.
beyond that.
Yeah.
Your voice is a reflection of your self-confidence, your joy, your creativity, your
Sure.
happiness, right? So she digs in for those
Oh
emotional
yeah.
things. Those do
Yeah.
not come from YouTube.
Right. And there's an experience of being with her, I bet. Right. And that, that is an irreplaceable thing, at least for now. Right.
I
Um,
think forever, but maybe that's delusional.
it's funny. Like I always, whenever I get up to the edge of something where it's like, well, that could never, or this will never be whatever, I always I back it up a little bit. Cause it seems like every time you say that, like 5 years later, there's a
There
thing
is no
like,
never anymore.
I remember there's a quote from someone will correct this in the comments, like whoever the head of the U.S. Patent Office in 1860 said something like, well, everything's been invented, we should close down the patent office because this is it. Right. And it's just like our imaginations carry us so much farther than we ever thought.
And I
And
love that so much because that's my counter also to the machines will take over everything. No, there's always a place for us to keep
yeah.
staying ahead and innovating and being creative and figuring out how do we get there.
Yeah. Well, so let's do a little bridge here. How are you using any sort of AI stuff in your world right now? And I'm thinking about our audience of, CEOs of growing companies. I'm sure they've enjoyed our philosophical rabbit hole dive here. But I'm curious, like both either in creative, but even in your pod and other worlds, how is AI making it into your world, and how do you keep it human?
Yeah, well, I mean, I started back 30 years ago, and I remember rotary phones, and I remember the joy of like, oh, I can fax something, and magic, my piece of paper shows up in
Yeah.
New York in a minute, right? And of course, now every single thing I do, I have this monitor in my office that's taller than my office manager, and uh, so everything we do is technologically based. But for many years, I feel like it was stagnant. We're using all the Adobe tools, and they're all the same. And like, if we just relate this to podcasting for a moment, um, a year ago in podcasting, I would have used Adobe Premiere, and it would have taken me 3 hours an episode or 4 hours an episode to edit it
Hmm.
and all these things. And now you're on Riverside and I'm on Riverside, and it's this platform that writes an amazingly well transcribed thing, and I can pick a word and go, why did I say but 3 times, and delete the
Yeah.
first 2 of them, and then and it edits the video for me, and it fixes our voices as needed, and it adds the branding, and it does all the stuff in a, I don't know, a fifth of the time,
Oh,
something like
easily.
that,
Oh my God. Yeah.
right? I
And
wouldn't
Premiere
be
is
able to do the podcast without the technology like this.
right.
I use an email system called Instantly, and Instantly takes my emails and runs campaigns, and then I can look at it and say, oh, well, these 3 campaigns have 3%, and every other campaign has 1% response rate, so turn off the other ones, and it
Mhm.
balances my load, and it basically A/B tests me, but with 10 different campaigns going on at the
Yeah.
same time, right? So that's how I can find people. Um, where else? I mean, I feel like every tool we have, I was making a thumbnail for somebody's video the other day, and the topic was parallel universes, and I'm like, where am I going to find an image of a parallel universe? And go to
Yeah.
Midjourney, and you know award-winning transformational background image of parallel universes, and pump out 3 or 4 prompts
Yeah.
like that, and one of them was astounding, and boom, brand new image that never existed of a parallel universe before, but kind of gets the idea across.
Yeah.
um, I use ChatGPT a fair amount. We all do, but for writing, but not for it to write things for me, but for it to be my uh, partner with ultimate patience. My wife
Yeah.
will only listen to me for like 5 minutes when I want to talk to her about bouncing ideas off, and ChatGPT will listen to me for hours of, well, how do I get deeper in this topic? Or give me 5 more ways to say this phrase right here. Or, um, you know, what do you think about this compared to my perfect source over here? Compare
Mhm.
and contrast these two.
Yeah.
So I like having a ultimately patient writing partner. So a lot of these basic tools are
Yeah. That's
are
great.
integrated into every day right now.
Well, so one of my theories about what AI can do is, I think it can make things that used to be inaccessible by either like a smaller brand, like maybe you or me, or something like a larger brand would be maybe like a long tail market that they would never touch. Like we could turn out a fully produced podcast, maybe a couple a day, honestly, with Riverside and Descript and all these other kind of
100%.
things. Whereas, in the past it might have been, oh, that's like a week, and then you got to send it out, and so like maybe one a month was like a big deal. But now we could keep up with, any provider is on level footing with any other provider, and I think so. So what I tell companies is like there might be a market that you thought would be kind of difficult to address because it's like, oh, I mean, the amount of effort it would take to do that. Well, now with the equivalent of whatever the tool would be, you might be able to produce either the content or the marketing. And you mentioned an email tool like sales. You could create a whole business unit for a longer tail that you wouldn't have touched. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for, maybe doing things differently in a way that you couldn't before. But now also, you and I can produce something that looks just as good as anyone else's because of all those great tools. I think that's really interesting.
Well, and I think what it provides me. Okay, so if we take the example of my photography, I do stage photography, so
Mm.
theater shoots, and they're really, really hard. That you got a spotlight, so it's blown out in the middle, and then the background's dark, but you want those colors to pop. And
Yeah.
I might take 3,000 pictures, and then they might want them the next day, and they want the best 10 or 12 to go to the press the next day.
Mm.
And so it's a really hard gig. And so a year ago, I was going through all those images in Lightroom one by one. It took an hour to load them into Lightroom. Took Lightroom an hour to process the
Yeah.
thumbnails. Every time I'd press the key, it would take a second or two for delay, blah, 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 right? Now the workflow is I have an AI app called Narrative AI, and Narrative helps me pre-select the photos, and it tells me who's in focus, and it tells me whose eyes are open, and it
Right.
ranks the photos for me. So I have a pre-rank, and it's instant, and then it only ships the ones I need to Lightroom. And then I trained my another app called Imagine.ai, IMAGEN, for those photographers out there. And Imagine has 20,000 of my photos, and it knows what I tend to do. And it says, oh, that photo was dark, and so he lightened the shadows. And that photo was bright, so he pulled down the highlights, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it pre-edits all my photos for me. And so instead of me saying, okay, it took 6 hours before, and it takes 6 hours now, but my 6 hours now are spent on making these images
Oh,
polished to that nth degree. And my photos are way better.
yeah.
I'm just not like skimping and saying, oh, well, now I can do it in 2 hours. Screw you. I'm
Right.
sitting there and polishing them. So my quality of photos is dramatically better.
Yeah. I think that's my message to a lot of the clients we work with is I don't think anyone's going to do less. I think you're going to be expected to do more and better. So, because we figured out some automation, that doesn't mean your customers expect less. They now expect it to be perfect and on time, all those things, because we know what's behind the scenes. And I think and if we go back to our earlier conversation, what you described, that's the Jason magic special work that makes the photography better. Whereas, I mean, picking
That's
through
the
the
humanness. Yeah.
20,000, I mean, that's like, ugh, we don't need to do that. Now I can elevate the quality and the artistry of what I'm doing. And P.S. Because you may not plug it, but everyone should go check out his site. His photography is really, really amazing. But I think that's the human part. That's what we want.
It's more rewarding and more fulfilling. Like, do I want to do the grunt work of waiting 2 seconds for 3,000 photos to scroll through my damn screen? Or do I want to, like, ooh, how do I pull that background out and make that guy pop a little bit, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I
But
almost want to confess to you that when we started this podcast, I left my overhead light on. I don't have my side thing on. I have my camera. So like, I feel like there's someone who knows photography. Like I really messed this one up. So I can do better. I promise. Well, so speaking of podcasting, I'm curious. So you actually you have a really great successful podcast. I'm curious what it's done for you, and if you're talking to other CEOs, what have you seen as far as benefits go to either doing one yourself, which is a big lift, or even just being on one? What are some of the phenomena you've seen happen over the last couple of years with
there's
podcasting?
so much. So I think one of my favorite things, and also I think this is business rewarding, is I assume that I knew my industry really well. And in some degrees, I do, right?
Mhm.
But it's completely different to have 10 clients and know those 10 clients in a certain way, and then to just talk every day with CEOs and people and hear their problems and hear their constraints and hear it from an industry-wide, broader
Mm.
perspective, and where I'm really just focused on that problem as opposed to build my email funnel or whatever the question I'm being asked by my client
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
I get to these higher level. So I particularly really love the learning, and there's all these little threads that have pulled out that I wasn't super cognizant of. Like, I don't think I was really as aware of how much AI and technology was changing the world until I started
mm,
to get on here. And I knew, but I
yeah,
didn't viscerally know. And now I viscerally, like, everyone is telling me that. So that's
yeah,
one benefit. Um, Another benefit, of course, is just the obvious of like meeting people in my desired niche. So I wasn't out there figuring out how to meet B2B AI and SaaS people all day long. And now I meet
yeah,
those people all day long. And I love that. And that obviously at some point results in more leads and more business. Um, Another thing is, Google's going the way of auto-generated AI captions, and the gamification of SEO and all that is going to diminish as we go down, and
mm,
it's going to be get back to the basics of like you better just have good content that's
yeah,
relevant, right?
yeah,
And I wasn't developing and making good content that was relevant, and I kept thinking, well, okay, I'll write this article or I'll write this blog, and that's hard to do. But to get on a phone and be like, well, Mike's super cool. Let's talk about technology for an hour. Like, I'm excited. It's fun. I love it. We're both
yeah,
going to have a transcript,
yeah.
right? This transcript is going to feed a search engine. So it's good for the business in that regard.
Mm.
And I enjoyed it and I'm learning. Um, so those are, I think, are the three, like off the top of my head,
Yeah.
really huge benefits of all
It's
this.
funny. I don't know if I thought about it that way, but one of the things I wish, and this is almost by definition, someone who's not listening to the podcast, but I know as we go out both in prospecting, but also for the business, but also for the podcast, I find there are a number of, um, a bigger percentage than I would have thought of executives who are in a way nowhere to be found online. They have a link. Here's a prospect like I see probably 4 or 5 times a day. LinkedIn. So $100 million company, LinkedIn profile, no picture, 18 connections, and Freddie has never posted, right?
Right.
They are nowhere. They're interviewed. They are not on YouTube. They're almost like in witness protection program for executives. I wonder if there's probably at least two scenarios, right? One is I don't care about any of that and I don't need any of that. Fine. The other one is it might be that there's probably a time, if we think about what we've talked about so far today, there's a time when like doing that would have been so hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I need a PR agency and I need to get a PR newswire account and I need to create content and all this kind of stuff. And my hunch and my bias is that there are probably a lot of people out there who are so smart about their business and know so much about a niche or a vertical or something. And all they would have to do would be to spend, 20 minutes with someone like you and create now their first, online content, and they have all this stuff. It's so much easier to be a part of this now global conversation than it used to be. And I feel like a lot of people are missing out because they just don't know. And I'm curious if that's ever something you think about.
Oh, I think about that all the time. It's 100% true. And it's funny because a lot of times people, sometimes they have been on podcasts and they get it and they're there and they're like intentionally seeking out, like, how do I get on more podcasts?
Yeah.
And sometimes they're like newer at it and they're like, man, this is fun and this is easy. And so the call ends and then they're like, tell me about podcasting. And we have this
Yeah.
exact conversation of like, why do you do it? And I think it's important if you're doing it for a business reason. I spoke with a great guy yesterday and he said, hey, someone told me to start a podcast, but they never said, how does this feed your business? And so he ended up with a
Mm.
top 2% podcast and he's doing really well. But it doesn't actually directly feed his business because he never looked at some of the business ways to the little tweaks.
Oh,
Like, can you interview once in a while some of your ICP, some of your ideal
yeah.
customer profiles? Like, if you're trying to talk to billion-dollar company CEOs and you have a great podcast, you're going to get them on, but you're not going to get them
Mm.
on a regular old phone call, right?
Sure. Right.
So could you do that every third or fifth client, or could you tweak your questions to just lead people? Could you? And he's like, I don't want to do the hard push. And I said, well, what if you just had someone record a commercial for your company and your company sponsors it? You know,
That's it.
let your company sponsor it.
Yeah.
You don't have to be the push man, but your
Hmm.
company can still push.
Yeah.
And I think there's all these easy ways that no one listening to a podcast, they actually expect these commercials. And almost to some degree, I had someone tell me one time, like, well, you seem more professional if you have a sponsor. Um, and so I could argue like, yeah, well, I tend to bounce at a 30-second commercial if I'm not interested enough.
Sure. Yeah.
But that just means be interesting enough to hold your people through your 30-second commercial.
Yeah. And honestly, I go back to you said something a second ago that I really liked, which is and the SEO and other things might turn more that you have to do good content. I think it's always been you have to do good content, right? And that seems to
I
that
don't
seems to cut
know.
through.
There's been a
And
minute or a decade that I see people spending 30, 40,000 a month on SEO and winning.
yeah, I mean, there was a time when like you'd go to a web page whose title was, software developer Chicago, and the headline was, "We developed software in Chicago for our Chicago people who like software, who like developed in
Exactly.
Chicago and like software." And it's like, oh my god, this is for a computer. This is not for a human.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, maybe I stayed out of the marketing game enough to not be annoyed by that, but
It's
but it's
so
coming back to content.
Google figured that out, obviously. So it just transformed to more subtle ways of doing it. But it
Yeah.
honestly, it's just been from my perspective, it's been like, how do we game this?
Mm.
And part of the game is, yes, you should make great content, but a lot of people don't want to put the effort towards that. And I think with all the AI stuff, that's inevitable. You have to spend some time at it. And this is one of the lowest hanging,
Yeah.
what do you call it? Let's edit this part out. This is one of the easiest ways to do that,
Mhm.
is talking to great people.
And by definition, to another theme, it's humans talking to humans. And this conversation took a really interesting philosophical turn that I didn't expect. And we took that turn, by the way, right out of the driveway. Like we
Mm.
didn't get very far at all when we were talking about this kind of stuff. And
So
I
the
think
bad
that's,
news is we turned off 25% of the people, but the people that are listening now, they're our type
they
of people.
love, they're eating this up. And that's all I care about.
By the
Uh,
way, someone told me one of the golden nuggets. So I ask everybody on my show, like, what's a golden nugget? Just to give
yeah,
some quick, here's a little bit of benefit that you
sure.
can have in the first minute of the show. And he said, hey, check out Notebook LLM, because you can go in there and feed it your topics, and then it will have a podcast on your topics, and it puts the two people together and does this whole Like it creates the two characters and they
Yeah.
argue with each other about the podcast. And I watched one of them and I'm like, oh, it's kind of terrible, but it's remotely interesting. Is it remotely interesting because I'm watching technology do this and it's a
Yeah.
cool thing that I've never seen, or is it actually interesting?
I put it this way. I don't know if you'd watch two of them,
No, I didn't. I
right?
wouldn't.
That's
You know
yeah.
what? You know how you know I wouldn't? Because I didn't.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Um, well, so listen, so with our remaining 25% who are still hanging around here, um, what is the best way to find you if they'd like to either continue a conversation, find out more about what you do, etc.? What's the best way to get you?
Yeah, they can look me up on LinkedIn at Jason Niedle, Niedle, or look me up at tethos.com, and that's TETHOS.com. There's a contact form on there, and there's links to all our socials and all that stuff.
Well, Jason, thanks for having a meandering, philosophical, fascinating conversation with me. To the 25% that made it, we appreciate you and hope you enjoyed the journey. And as always, I'm Mike Lavista. This is the Digital Transformist. If you like this kind of stuff, don't forget to subscribe so you hear about more of this when I get more interesting people like Jason Niedle on the podcast. Thanks for listening to the Digital Transformist. This is Mike Lavista. And if you like that content, subscribe so you can get notified of new content when it comes out.